Morning, morning, monsters. Brain-computer interfaces, area that I'm not an expert on, and something that I am learning a lot about, and I want to spend a lot of time this year deving on. However, I do have experience with VR, I have experience with product design, and I generally keep up to date with trends, and as I say, I've started reading quite a bit into it. I keep my eye on BCI for a while, but I honestly take a lot longer for the developments that have happened. And there's been an acceleration in the space that's really interests me, and when certain players did certain things, I was like, okay, BCI, now time to pay attention. So technically, a keyboard is a brain-computer interface. Not a very good one, but it is technically a brain-computer interface. It's worth acknowledging that the tech is broader than people think. However, when people think about brain-computer interfaces, they normally think about the sensor bands or the shower caps on your head, and they're normally thinking about either EEG, which is the more traditional one, or they're thinking about FNIRS. I forget what the F stands for. Near-infrared spectrography, which is basically if you shine a light, a very bright infrared light, you can penetrate somewhat, and you can get a bit of a reading from under with very sensitive diodes that we have now. So there was actually a research paper ages ago that I remember that kicked off a lot of this trend, at least among tech people, not necessarily around academics, which was with a basic webcam like this at 60 frames per second. If I'm close enough to the camera, the minute variation in skin tone that honestly the Twitch encoder would throw away. So if you were to do it on like a YouTube or a Twitch video, you'd have a harder time. But in the raw feed, it's measurable. You'd be able to detect the minor variation in skin tone every time my heart beats and flushes blood through my face, and so you could read my heart rate. This drove the health watch craze, and I actually don't use these as a health watch as much. I'm more like up for the notifications, though the step tracking and things like that's pretty good. There we go, I'm getting it to fire there. So you'll see that there is some LEDs firing there. What you're not seeing, because this camera's got a filter on it and stuff, they're a very harsh green light. And other than the LEDs, there's a little sensor there. And that flash there basically helps detect the amount of the pulse and the darkness or the light absorption rate of the blood, which gives them a pretty terrible reading on... No, this one doesn't do oxygenation. Oxygenation uses a different light setup. But anyway, we can detect a bunch of stuff off your wrist, mostly with this near-infrared kind of tech. And heart rate being the most common one. Heart rate is the one that everyone goes for. Yeah, so this tech's blown up, and as I say, keyboards are already technically BCI. So it's a broad spectrum, and I think people narrowly too focused on sticking wires in the brain and think that's what BCI is going to be. No, BCI is a little bit more complicated, and I think the best place to start with that is to talk about Valve, Apple, and some other players. So here's the thing people don't realize. Okay, faceplate on my headset and watch. I'm going to start off with what Valve's doing because they're a little bit more open and they've been out there. If you look at the OpenBCI website, you can see the Gallia's information, but you can also see like the OpenBCI shower cap kind of design. Now, generally speaking, the head straps for VR headsets only need a slight bit of modification to basically provide really good mounting points for FNIRS sensors and EEG sensors. There is a distinction here, by the way, between wet and dry sensors. Wet sensors historically have been more effective, but here's the thing. The same way with this, when it was first proposed, a lot of medical people were like, yeah, but it won't necessarily sit right and da-da-da-da-da. Not important, because one of the things we've realized is as long as you get enough signals, even if they're a little bit dirty or the sensor's misaligned or whatever, over time you can correct for it. And so we've gone with a dirty sensor approach usually. So wet sensors are much better for EEG stuff and whatnot, because they just get a cleaner reading. But that's a huge negative on the product side. People don't want to deal with that. So anyway, when we talk about all this stuff, we're talking about dry sensors generally. And also note that not all sensors, like not all cameras, are the same. There's a big difference between shooting with a potato old function phone versus a DSLR, right? So there's going to be a lot of, and there really are a lot of cheaper BCI products on the market that are shit, which is also one of the reasons I had a false impression of the quality of where BCI was. So anyway, the head strap is really interesting, but here's the thing that people overlook, right? If you push this on your face here, you see where that's covering. Okay, I know it looks ridiculous. Take your fingers, open there, just put your fingers loosely there, and then just move your upper face, and you'll see that obviously, because it's right there, you can detect what's going on with the eyebrows and stuff, which is a lot of the animation when we talk. Okay, fairly obvious. But what about your lower face? The part we're interested in sensing is this bit here. But if you put your fingers here, where the thing rests, and you move your jaw, you can feel just how much animation you can pick up from there. You wouldn't be able to pick it up all, but machine learning algorithms are pretty good at inferring this kind of stuff. Finally, there's a patent. There's a patent from Apple that showed up, which was about a chin sensor, and I saw lots of people with terrible news articles pointing at like having a chin strap. No, that's not at all what they're doing. Remember, they're working on their ultimate goal is AR, but Apple's very focused on AR. For this, just where your glasses would normally sit, so here, put your fingers like this, and now move your jaw, especially to the left and right, up and down, and especially if you do both sides, the amount of jaw motion you can detect by monitoring these areas, huge amount. And that's a win not only for facial tracking in terms of capturing all that, but it's also very useful in terms of voice commands and talking on the phone, like noise filtration. Because if my lips aren't flapping, then don't activate the noise gate, basically. So there's some pretty cool things there. I think most people are onto that. The thing that people aren't as onto is, obviously VR headsets being equipped with these sensors, fairly obvious it's going to happen. How long it takes and what sensors went out, the thing. But notice those sensors that I talked about there, they're very cheap, very easy to equip onto a device. And also because the other nice thing about this kind of tech is they're pretty private. They're not like cameras or whatever. Interesting side note. There is already a little infrared sensor with most of these things that points there, like a near reflection camera, to basically detect when you're wearing the headset or not wearing the headset. It is also the perfect sensor to pick up someone's heart rate from that method I talked about earlier with the forehead and the blood flush. Every hardware manufacturer I know of forbids that application from software developers for health and privacy concerns, because there's things. So there's actually a lot of regulation stuff that we have to figure out with this stuff. It's not totally smooth sailing. We're very much still talking about academic land. Even though I'm saying I'm excited to get my hands on this stuff's rollout is going to be frustratingly slow for hobbyists and fans, but for people who are actually really interested in development side, it's going to go a lot faster than we think. Alright, so all of that's been face stuff. A lot of people talk about VR gloves. VR gloves are very unlikely to succeed because people don't like putting on gloves. There's a whole bunch of reasons and research around it. They will be a thing, and they are a thing for the intense people, but they're not going to be a common thing. Turns out, well, so there's also a lot of variation in hand size and things or whatever. When we do product design, we get these body scans based on geography and region and stuff, so you can figure out when you're designing your Nike or when you're designing your mug, for instance, what the average handhold for someone is, and like how big their hands are and their fingers are and stuff like that. And then you go, oh, we're targeting this demographic, let's optimize for this hand size and blah, 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 blah. It's not just thumbsuck. There are some companies that thumbsuck, but they're generally pretty shit. And if you don't, by the way, have the funding to get your hands on these kind of research papers or these kind of data sets, because they can be quite expensive, there's an old trick called the McDonald's effect, which is instead of doing the best research about where to build your restaurant, just build it next to the nearest McDonald's because they've done all their research. Assuming the McDonald's is relatively new. So you can take another product on the market from a big player, assuming it's recently developed and doesn't have historical baggage, and do it there. We've spoken about economics with the DS4, but I'll talk about that story another time. Anyway, the point is, there is another thing that we know that doesn't vary much, is a form factor that scales well, and we've got a lot of knowledge for that, and that is the watch. Or more aptly, a bracelet rather than a watch. So remember the face thing I told you about? I want you to do the same thing, wrapping your fingers around your wrist, and then move your hand. It's a bit harder to sense, and you might have to actually just change your grip to sense it. But the thing is all the muscles that are driving your fingers are actually down your forearm, and there's one or two that actually extend to ligaments over here. There's a famous marble sculpture by Michelangelo where there's a small muscle, I think here, that doesn't move unless your pinky moves or whatever. I am not a medical student, but the point is that just by doing this kind of infrared spectrography stuff we've been talking about, we can detect already a lot about what's going on in the hand. Okay, that's really, really interesting. The other thing that we know with the social implementations, oh yeah, Monday I talk about the lip tracker stuff, and then I post the blog post yesterday, and then HTC finally comes out and says, hey, here's our lip tracker, here's the price. It's been floating around in dev circles for a while, so not a huge shocker. So anyway, we know that the general thing that people are settling on is an inner camera in the headset, like the old eye tracking headsets, to do eye tracking and basic brow and blah blah manipulation. Now, just because you have that doesn't mean you don't want the sensors in the faceplate, because I haven't mentioned the concept of sensor fusion, but sensor fusion is a really big concept in all this tracking tech and whatnot to improve the quality. So anyway, we know there's a camera there, and we now see that there is a push to get a camera on your lips and your mouth. Whether that camera is out here on the HTC mount where it's pointed like that, or whether that camera is mounted basically just like on the tip, like there-ish, pointing down, is a product design / research thing that I'll level out. Camera distortion is something we're getting pretty good at correcting for these days. We already have in the Quest the hand tracking cameras. So the cameras that are used for SLAM tracking can also be used for tracking somewhat. But there's a limit, right? Here's the thing, when we go to the wrist watch or bracelet configuration, and there's a reason I keep on going with the word bracelet, because the sensors tend to want to be all around because the muscle configuration I talked about before, but also you want enough thickness with a bracelet that the cameras on the bracelet can be high enough or low enough. And I've seen different configurations in research stuff, but basically the advantage of putting a camera here is twofold. First of all, the camera is really near the hand that you want to track, and you can do a wide angle lens, no problem. But a bigger thing is when we train machine learning algorithms, mostly in factories, to do things like factory line inspection, and one of the things we really benefit from, which sucks in the real life, is the camera is perfectly set up to that factory line. When you do hand tracking from the SLAM camera, this hand position is the same no matter how I rotate, but the image that the camera is seeing is drastically different because of wrist rotation and perspective skew, and there's a lot to correct for there. So what the algorithm initially does is try to do like forearm tracking and try to like skew perspective correction, and there's a lot of complicated stuff that people do to try simplify the image recognition part for the hand stuff. If you're on the wrist, you basically eliminate, you still have obviously wrist movement like that, but you basically eliminate all of the forearm screw correction, and the camera is always getting as close a image of the hand as possible. And so your hand tracking model will just be way more robust. So that's a huge appeal for it to be in the wrist. Also, the other thing is, if you do have a wrist bracelet like that, tracking the wrist bracelet from lighthouses or from your headset is significantly easier than, say, tracking your hand, because you can put markers on it. And so you've already got a pretty decent forearm solve there when you throw in with the thing. Because this is the other thing, is different sensors and different systems will have slightly different latencies in your like sensor fusion or whatever, and so some data will come through more reliably faster and some data will come through less reliably slower. So yeah, mixing all that up is really good. So I think the wrist form factor is going to be a huge winner, and I think you're going to be seeing the wrist form factor from Apple. I don't know if we'll be seeing it from Valve. I'll be very interested to see what Valve does. I know that Facebook is probably going to be doing a wrist version. They've got one in R&D. Whether or not it comes out, so a whole nother story. A lot of these companies have things in R&D. You'd be amazed at how much stuff dies in R&D. But yeah, anyway, so yeah, wrist trackers. Wrist trackers is going to be a big deal. I think for gamers, wrist trackers are less interesting. It's more of a practical tool. Obviously for social gaming like VR chat and things like that, makes a lot of sense. However, if you're doing a zombie shooter or whatever, the knuckles really are good. Like, having something in your hand with physical buttons is a huge, huge win. So this is why I started the whole thing here saying, hey, keyboard is a brain-computer interface, because it is. It's a very abstracted interface, but like we've done a lot of studies with mice, for instance, about how the human brain maps your movement to mice and stuff. And basically, people who've used a mouse for enough years build a mental model in their brain of the mouse being part of your body. It's something the humans developed when we were first developing tools, where we like think, oh, the hammer's an extension of my arm. It's like a mental modeling thing we do. That's pretty dope, actually. It's pretty cool how we can drive that in. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to talk about and deep dive on. You'll notice I haven't actually spoken about EEG stuff at all. It's the area I'm weakest on, but it's also the area that I think is the most overhyped with BCI stuff. I think it'll show huge long-term returns, but at the moment it's mostly being used for mood sensing and analytic stuff rather than direct input. Most of the direct input stuff's being done with invasive BCI, which is basically where we stick wires in your brain. We will improve on that. But I think in the near future, the stuff I'm talking about now has actually been proven academically for a while. So productizing it is a lot safer. And if you stay away from the EEG angle and the brain reading angle, I think you'll also have a much easier time with regulation. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that all rolls out. We'll get into a world that is interesting. Is the word. Interesting is the word. That being said, monsters, any questions? It's lovely to see some of you here. It really is. Yeah, any questions? Fire away. It was also good to see the Tundra tracker was announced at a lower price point. The new HTC tracker was a surprise to me, actually. I didn't think they'd come out with it so soon. I was also surprised that they were more expensive than the previous generation. Yeah, the HTC tracker thing, it's interesting. Yeah, shoot away, Beta. I might not be able to answer it now, but shoot away. But yeah, the new tracker from HTC, I'm really glad it got USB-C on there. Apparently Shen had to fight for that, which is understandable because a lot of people don't understand that USB-C still has much more expensive licensing. So it's not just about technically putting USB-C in your device, you have to conform to a lot more electronic stuff, so your part cost goes up, but then you also have to pay a licensing fee. So USB-C is not free to put into things. There's a reason you're seeing a slower adoption with USB-C. So yeah, there's that. But I was also really loved that the Tundra tracker is going to use one dongle rather than an array of dongles, because it means that you use less USB bandwidth, which is good to see.